Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Welcome everyone to this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio. I am joined by Anthony Nieves, who is the committee chair for the Institute for Supply Management's Services Report on Business. It's the 80 or 85% of the economy. Just to give you credit for that, Anthony. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate being on the show.
Well, I just love having you. Love to find out what's going on with the ISM report, which seems to be, again, very strong. Let's walk through it. I know that our listeners and our viewers are going to be fascinated by it.
Well, we look at the release this morning, and the composite index for services came in at 52.7. It's down ever so slightly, 1.2 percentage points month over month from last month's reading of 53.9. And what we're starting to see, and before I go through the indexes, and I noted this on the teleconference on the release this morning, that we've had some anomalies as it pertains to what we've seen on the diffusion indexes based on going into the pandemic, post-pandemic with the pent-up demand. Now we're getting into a little bit of normalcy here, where we're seeing the report align more with historical trends of what we've seen in the past. We typically see this ever so slight pullback in the summer months, and then we get that buildup in the fall going into the last quarter. It keeps carrying strong, and with the holiday season, and then we go back to a bit of pullback, as we enter the new year. But overall, I'll go through the sub-indexes that comprise the composite. Business activity still remains strong. It's at 57.1. That's also had a little bit of pullback, 2.1 percentage points. New orders coming off ever so slightly, a half a percentage point from the 55.5 to 55. Employment, 50.7. That's down 2.4 percentage points. We should note that on employment, our respondents, the panelists, are kind of mixed as they've been in the past. It's a variable expense for this sector, and they like to control the variable expense as business demand wanes ever so slightly. But also, they're still having difficulty backfilling positions. The last index that makes up this composite, 48.1 for supplier deliveries. It's up a little bit, but deliveries are still fast, and that's all due to the improvements in the supply chain, the improvements in capacity and logistics as well. So that's just the top line part of the report. We can get into the other indexes, but overall, when you look at this, it's steady as she goes for the services sector as it relates to what the numbers are telling us for this month. Again, slight pullback, but not much.
Well, that's great information, Anthony, and it's encouraging. What we're beginning to hear is that all of the gloom and doom of recessionary talk is beginning to fade. It's not panning out that we're looking at a recession in 2023. The GDP is bumping around 2, and it's expected to hang in there at about 2, probably for the balance of the year.
Yeah, good observation. I was asked this question earlier today about recession. And in prior months, if you think back to even around the first of the year, right after we contracted in December, everyone was fearful of a recession. And our respondents told us in the semi-annual forecast that we released back in December that things would be better in 2023 as far as the second half versus the first half. There was no talk of recession. We look at the components that make up a recession. We have GDP growth. We have inflation is high, but it's starting to moderate a bit. Unemployment is low. So we have all these different variables that we're looking at, and right now it's they're not talking about recession at all. I'm not seeing it in the comments section from the panelists.
Well, that's encouraging because they're the boots on the ground in this, and I know you gather from hundreds of respondents. So if they're not worried about recession or they're not making comments about it, it's probably not looming its ugly head.
Well, the panelists, the respondents, they're cautious. It's in the headline comment there for the report. They're cautiously optimistic. Not to overuse that term, we've heard that through the years, but we have so much going on right now. Geopolitical concerns, with Europe and what's going on with China, and then we have the war in Ukraine. I mean, there's just so many variables out there that could, impact the overall global economy, not just the U.S. economy. And so they're just a little bit, cautious about what might, develop down the road. So they're just hedging themselves a bit here. But right now, if you look across these industries, 14 had reflected growth according to the composite index, and we seem to be moving along. The Fed's just raised the rate recently. Hopefully, we're not going to see that on a continued path going forward. Who knows? But I think as they're taming inflation, hopefully the rates stabilize, and we may even have some reductions. I'd like to see reductions down the road as things get better.
Anthony, I'm just wondering if you can kind of walk through two columns on this report. We don't do this very often, but I think it's important to kind of give people a sense of security, if you will. The trends column and the index column. For instance, the services PMI has been on a strong trend. It's slowing a little bit, but still growing for 7 months in a row.
Yes, that's a great point. When you look at the index column, you see the 52.7, and right next to it for June is 53.9. You see the percentage of change is down 1.2 percentage points. The direction is growing, and people say, well, how is it growing if it's reduced from month over month? Because remember, the baseline is 50, and it's a diffusion index measuring directional change. So anything above 50 reflects growth. It's that rate of growth that we're measuring. So the next column after direction, where it says growing, is rate of change, which is slower, but it's still growing, but just at a slower rate. And the trend is how many months in a row have we seen that trend? And so if we hit 50, that would be unchanged. So anything below 50 would be contraction. Above 50 would be growth. Same thing, increase, decrease, same. Because we ask our respondents, our panelists, to measure each of these areas, and it's like, how does it change month over month? Is it better, the same, or worse? Greater, the same, or less? So, and then you take the greater and half of the same, and that's how you come up with your diffusion index, so that you don't have any what you call biased to one direction.
Right.
So, and it's weighted by contribution to GDP for each of the industries that comprise the sector, 18 industries.
And chat a bit on business activity, because that trend is really strong, and I kind of measure it when I drive by restaurants at 6 o'clock at night. If their parking lot is full, I'm feeling like the economy is doing well.
Well, the accommodation and food services is one of those areas where you see experiences, right? They have to buy commodities in order to serve the patrons and the guests, but the dining out experience, and I'm going to put a caveat on this, and I'll tell you why. We see restaurants are busy, and we see that they definitely are. I was just out last night, and I could see that 2 restaurants right next to one another were doing fantastic. But then you also have to take into consideration how many restaurants closed during the pandemic, right? So we had some high restaurant fatalities there. But overall, things are picking up. The same thing in the hotel industry, they're starting to pick up. So in essence, that's a good measure of foot traffic and what we see. And again, I've mentioned this in prior shows that it seems that people are definitely doing vacations, and they're traveling, and they're going out to restaurants. So they're spending more on experiences versus just consumer goods.
Now, for those of you who are interested in the trends column of this report, I encourage you to go to ismworld.org. And in their menu, you'll find a link to the report on business. This is the services report on business. We've done the manufacturing report. They have a hospital report. Really great in-depth information and an overview that has, I will share with you, Anthony, been spot on in terms of where the economy is, where it was, and largely where it's going. coming out of ISM's reporting.
When you look at the additional indexes that comprise the report on business, and I touched on the four, which are weighted equally 25% to come up with the composite business activity, new orders, employment, supplier deliveries. The next set of indexes, starting with inventories, that came down 5.5 percentage points, 50.4. And what our respondents are telling us is that they're trying to operate their businesses with lower inventory. They're trying to right-size their inventory. Inventories were built up during the course of the pandemic because of increased order frequency and quantities because they weren't getting the deliveries. There was backlog, there was disruption of the supply chain. Remember all the container ships off port that weren't being offloaded. So now that's all waned, and now it's about right-sizing those inventories. And this sector is more demand pull, less reliant on inventories as you would see in manufacturing. And it is about cash liquidity and not tying it up, sitting on a shelf somewhere. Prices, we're at 56.8. It's up 2.7 percentage points month over month. But yet, think back, during the pandemic, those prices were over the 70 percentile, close to 80, around 80, highest levels of for that index that we had seen in years since probably the recession back in 2008. So now prices are starting to moderate, and that's why the Fed is hopefully will, as they've worked to stave off inflation, will not be as aggressive in rate increases going forward, even though they just recently raised it 25 basis points. You look at backlog, it grew month over month. We were way down at 43.9 last month, which is definitely not typical. But now we're at 52.1, which is up 8.2 percentage points. As I mentioned, still things are much better in the supply chain. So backlog, all related to capacity, improved logistics, even trucking metrics. One of the respondents mentioned how they're even better. We got that from the wholesale trade arena.
Well, that's encouraging. We love to see the backlog of orders going up. That means there's always something to work on in the pipeline, and sales are taking place in order to create that backlog. How about imports and exports? I see that new export has been very strong.
It has been, and less, there's some retail involved in that, but most of it is based on the information, knowledge management type pieces we like to categorize, or I should say I like to categorize it, and that's around management of companies and support services, professional scientific technical services, information, which is the technology arena. It's what we export more than anything versus, say, just straight commodities. As we know, we have always imported more than we exported when you looked at GDP, or I should say, yes, GDP. But anyway, exports has been holding steady, only down 0.4 percentage points. And imports continues to grow, but at a much slower rate, or I should say a slightly slower rate, down 2.3 percentage points to 52.3. Some of the things that are coming up is companies looking to shift their supply routes from, being so reliant on Asia and China, and seeing what other alternate supply routes they can use. We just had such contentious relationship recently, so hopefully it doesn't impact the supply chain that much.
Inventory sentiment seems to be that, and we've seen some of this in manufacturing, where they're finally getting to the point where they've burned off the inventory they had, and now they're getting to order a little bit. How is it in the services sector?
It's similar. I mentioned about the cash liquidity. When you look at the reading, what's the difference between the inventories versus inventory sentiment? Inventories is what actually exists and how much it's grown month over month or decreased. Whereas the sentiment, we ask them, how do they feel their levels of inventory match up or applicable to their business activity or their business levels? So they feel the inventories are still slightly higher than what their needs and requirements are to run their businesses. And so it's up 56 to 56.6, 2.6 percentage increase from the 54. But overall, again, I can't emphasize enough that less reliant on inventory. People always ask me, what's inventory in services? Is there any inventory? Well, we talked about restaurants, we talked about hotels. They have to keep inventory, food inventory, beverage inventory, paper supplies. guest amenities, all that kind of stuff is inventory. And if you look at inventory on an annualized basis, whatever you have sitting on the shelf, it's like 25% of its value is associated with carrying costs of that inventory. So that's what you mean by, having cash liquidity and not have it just sit there and be in more demand pull or just in time. We went from just in time to just in case to fly by the seat of your pants all in 1 year.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, the pandemic was a wild ride, and we're still feeling the repercussions of that. Overall, Anthony, a very strong report for what occurred in July. How is this translating into GDP? Is it consistent in that 2% range?
Well, the composite index, when you look at it and convert it on an annualized basis, it's actually a little bit less. It's at 1% GDP. So, but again, that's annualizing. This number is going to move. It's going to either get, grow or, contract. It just depends on, I shouldn't say increase or decrease, but it just depends on where we're at. And as I mentioned, the summer is typically a little bit slower than what we might see coming into the fall, especially. I always like to say October is definitely September is the pivotal month. October will tell you where you're really going. And then you see how it is going into the holidays. Then we're back at it again in January. It's right around the corner. We're already get on the latter part of the year here. It's amazing how fast it went.
It's frightening how fast it goes. Anthony, what's your sense of the balance of 2023? Is it consistent with we're okay, we're not hearing recession?
I think we're going to stay on this path of steady incremental growth. When we had some huge spikes in the past on the composite as well as business activity and new orders, I was asked the question, was it sustainable? I think at these levels, this is a sustainable rate for the sector. We'll have to see. I mean, I don't have the crystal ball, but each month as I see the data come in and I try to get a feel for it based on what the respondents tell us in addition to what the actual diffusion indexes are. And all indications are that we'll stay on this path of growth. I think we need to keep an eye on the employment picture. And as I mentioned, it is a mixed bag, but it's just above the baseline at 50.7. As this index goes, with this labor intensive sector, that's how the sector goes. So hopefully, it's more attributed to lack of workers versus companies getting more into the layoffs and not hiring and just being too cautious based on the uncertainty that is still a little bit on the fringe with all the geopolitical concerns that are out there.
You had mentioned that there's still difficulty filling positions in the services sector. And since that's 85% of the economy, and the open jobs report from the Department of Labor is something like 9.8 million open jobs. Services sector must be sitting on 8 million open jobs and scratching their heads.
It's true. I mean, what we noticed, there was a trend of individuals getting into certain other areas and getting away from the tedious work or some of the work that, especially in the hospitality industry, in the accommodation and food services, the hours and the swing shifts and it's not easy work. And so people were trying to upgrade and do different things and chasing the money. And so it's created voids. It filled one place, creates a void somewhere else. So it's just a matter of, I think that there's some people that haven't even re-entered the workplace. And there's no measurement on that since the pandemic. And so there's, I get a mixture of comments from the respondents, from retirees and can't backfill the position, attrition, we're being cautious, not backfilling the position. Others can't find suitable workers. It's a hodgepodge there. And then there's the others that are like, we're waiting and seeing how things develop. And others can't find enough qualified workers. One thing I'm not overly concerned with is because of, even though we seasonally adjust majority of these indexes, I shouldn't say majority, but some of the indexes, employment is typically in the summer. People are on vacation. There's less activity when it comes to hiring at that point in time. And so I think it's more of a fall thing if you see some of these backfill open positions getting filled.
And I suspect that there's going to be a growth in need come the holiday season. When does that hiring actually begin to take place, Anthony?
It varies. You see in the retail, it's like they start gearing up because there's a cycle time involved. So they start gearing up, latter part of September, October to get ready for, as you get into toward Thanksgiving, and, you have Black Friday and you have all those different online things as well. I mean, we've changed as far as society. There's so much more online distribution than there was, even 10 years ago. And people became more accustomed to it, especially during the pandemic. But again, there's still the touch and feel of people wanting to get out during the holiday season. So they're definitely, whether the increase in labor happens on the customer facing versus on the back end of it in the online distribution, it's still people.
Yes, no doubt. Well, as we begin to wrap up this segment, sum up for us how this report looks to you and how we're kind of looking for the end of the year. And I appreciate you being with us.
Oh, certainly. So when we look at the services sector, we still have this trend of growth of 7 months, business activity, 38 months of growth. So we're going to continue on this incremental path, incremental growth path. And I think that as we get past the summer months, we'll start seeing some more activity. Our respondents are telling us that they're optimistic, but cautiously optimistic about what's going on. And I think at this level of growth that we're seeing, it's more sustainable than having something overheat in the economy. Less talk about recessionary period. Inflation seems the Fed's doing a decent job of combating that. But overall, I think next month we'll see some similar indexes coming in, maybe slightly higher, maybe slightly lower, but overall, again, as I mentioned previously, September will be the pivotal month, and we'll see how this trends out.
Looks good, sounds good. Anthony, again, I want to thank you, and I also want to thank the Institute for Supply Management for making you folks available to us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a great day. Thanks for having me on the show.
Love to have you here, and thanks everyone for joining us on this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio.
That's our show for today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please like and subscribe, share on social media, or leave a review. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Rumble, or your favorite podcast app. Visit us online at mfgtalkradio.com for our other episodes. We have also included links to our advertisers below. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.